13 English Colonies, The Foundation for America, Part 2. New York was founded by King James, the Duke of York. Um, if we remember correctly, the colony of New York was actually originally New Netherlands, founded by the Dutch, but James was able to kick them out of there, I should say. He first started by granting huge land grants to two friends of his, George Carteret and John Berkeley. He also then moved to grant a bunch of land grants to rich Englishmen, who then charged ridiculously high amounts of rent to be able to work land on their property, which caused huge gaps between the rich and the poor and caused outrage by the poor. And so this caused people to clamor for rights or to kind of speak out for rights of the people. And so eventually James gave in and allowed them to establish a small committee, basically, which drafted 15 different bills, which were all basic rights that they felt as English citizens they should have. However, James wasn't having this, and so he disbanded the assembly and essentially nullified that. However, about 6 years or so later, the people had had enough, and so they got rid of the governor and replaced them with their own. And under the new governor, they were able to establish more rights than they had previously been able to. Pennsylvania was established by a man by the name of William Penn, and so King Charles essentially allowed William Penn the grant for the colony of Pennsylvania for two reasons. First being that the king owed a significant amount of debt to William's father, Admiral Penn. And then the second one being that William was a Quaker. And so a lot of the Quaker beliefs went against some of the beliefs or the other beliefs of the Church of England, which was an Anglican church. And so the Quaker beliefs were things like, for example, that people should live a simple life, that all people should be treated equally, that people shouldn't pay taxes to the English church, they shouldn't bow down to the king, they shouldn't fight in wars, things like that. It got so bad at one point that William was even locked up and imprisoned, essentially, by the king. However, the king figured once he was released that he would stop preaching what he was preaching, but instead he continued to do so. So when the king sent him away to the New World, it was kind of beneficial for the king as well. So in Pennsylvania, Penn set up his capital city of Philadelphia, which stands for the City of Brotherly Love, and established one of the first early democracies, or kind of where the people kind of make up the government, in Philadelphia. Maryland was another charter of the 13 original colonies, and this was originally thought of by a man by the name of George Calvert. And George Calvert had a fear and was frustrated with the fact that he didn't feel that he could properly worship as his religion as he saw fit, since he was Catholic. And as I said, the Church of England was Anglican, which was a Protestant church. And so he kind of had a vision where both Protestant and Catholic could both worship equally and do kind of their own thing. But unfortunately for George, he had petitioned the king all the way up until the point of his death and still saw no ground in that area. However, the king, after George's death, appointed his son Cecil Calvert the land grant that his father George had desperately sought. And so, moving to the New World, essentially, Cecil made sure that both Protestant and Catholic alike could worship freely. And so this is where we saw one of the very first laws get passed in regards to freedom of religion. And so this was very significant. However, it's also important to note that this did not apply to all religions, as religions like Judaism or Jewish, Muslim, basically any other religion other than Protestant or Catholic was kind of excluded from this religious law. The colony of Virginia, or the Charter for Virginia, was heavily based on tobacco farming, as it was known as what's called a cash crop because it was worth a lot of money. However, this led to the use of giant plantations, which were giant farms, which needed people to work them. At first, they would use the Native Americans or Indians, as most people know them, to work the land. But the problem is most of the Indians weren't farmers by nature, and on top of that, a lot of them died due to the various diseases brought over by the colonists. So what ended up happening is they would bring in people who were essentially prisoners, and they could work off their debt to society, so to speak, by working the land. And eventually, when they did work off their debt or their prison sentence, they would then essentially be free and given a small plot of land and the necessary tools and stuff that it would take to essentially work the land and make a living for themselves and a better life. However, eventually people started bringing in indentured servants from Africa, and then somebody got the idea that, well, what if we just didn't release them at the end of their required time? And so this led to the 1661 Virginia House of Burgesses, where they essentially extended this concept of slavery to a lifelong sentence. To make matters worse is that because the people from Africa were used to farming and were hard workers, and then on top of that, because their skin tone was a lot darker than the Europeans, colonists, they were easy to identify. And so it was a lot harder for them to escape. So this made slavery really popular. All right, so moving on to Georgia, which is the final colony that we're going to cover in this particular video. It was founded by a man by the name of James Oglethorpe. And essentially, James's grand vision, so to speak, for his colony was to be a place where prisoners, just like in Virginia, could come to sort of work off their debt to society and be set free and kind of make a better life for themselves. However, what actually happened was that essentially people preferred the prisons in England than coming to the New World with all the risk of, death and disease and all the other stuff that potentially could happen to them in the New World. So essentially, they favored the known versus the unknown. This was a huge kink to James's plan, as his original plan depended heavily on um, the prisoners being brought over. So he did, however, get a bunch of people to come with him. They just weren't what he originally wanted. And to make matters worse, um, and eventually what led to his kind of being disposed of, is that his vision for Georgia was that, uh, much like the Quaker belief, he believed in a simple life, and he believed in things like no alcohol, and that everybody should essentially only own a small piece of land, and that they should work their own land. And he actually outlawed slavery, which had become so popular in Virginia, which was essentially one of Georgia's neighbors at the time. And so the Georgian people saw the success and the wealth that came from the large plantations and the use of slaves, and they wanted that for themselves. So eventually they got rid of James Oglethorpe and started plantations, and really that's when Georgia's economy really picked up and became more wealthy, just like Virginia.